It looks as though repatriation flights will resume on the 15th of May, but not before then. And that's despite the country reaching 300,000 cases for a 12th straight day. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is making an embarrassing backdown after a truly shameful decision that him and Greg Hunt announced last week. He can spin this any way as want. He locked the door to Australian citizens who desperately need to come home. India has developed to such a state where if one of the 9,000 Australian Indians are not able to stay free of COVID, in other words, need the Indian medical attention, they are in real trouble. This is the definition of Australians being in harm's way. And the Prime Minister should show leadership, and he should get on the phone to Alan Joyce at Qantas and say, we're going to run not just the odd repatriation flight, we're going to bring them back home. But the drivel, the absolute incompetent drivel I heard this morning from the Prime Minister just beggared belief. The quarantine system is not there to say everybody who arrives from overseas has to be COVID-free. The purpose of quarantine is to detect the COVID people who've got COVID and put them into further isolation to protect the Australian public. It's not about saying no one is allowed into Australia, into our quarantine system, if they've got COVID. That is the purpose of it.
But Labor supported the pause on flights.
Well, as I said, I'm giving you my view, and I think Labor has quickly realised the error and has been demanding that he explain himself what the medical advice is. And I think Labor's movement on this has helped push, along with many other Australians. Many commentators on this network, from Andrew Bolt to Rita Panahay to Peter Credlin, have all said this is an unconscionable. Last night, Michael Kroger, this is an unconscionable decision that they've made. And because he's had a year to get a national quarantine system put in place, and he's done nothing but blame the states, he is demonstrating the absolute lack of leadership. He's just looking at the polls and going, oh, right, I'll get away with this. Show some leadership, Scott Morrison. Get those Australians in harm's way back to Australia into our quarantine system. Because I'll tell you what's safer for them is being in Australia's quarantine system than sitting waiting to catch COVID in India.
Well, I mean, on that, Paul Kelly, in his letter to the Health Minister last week, he says each new case identified in quarantine increases the risk of leakage into the Australian community through transmission to workers, other returnees, and subsequently into the Australian community more broadly. So doesn't something like that give you pause, particularly when you bear in mind the fact that the infection rates in quarantine have risen by 1,500% here?
Yeah, look, this is the purpose of quarantine is to detect the people who have COVID, not to go, oh, great, everyone who came into quarantine is COVID-free. That is not the point. But there's 2 points to Mr. Kelly, and this is a continuation of the disgraceful information that they've been serving up to the government. Last year, they told us masks weren't necessary. It wasn't airborne. Now we're seeing more and more cases that can't be explained in quarantine, and the AMA and WA have said it is now clearly airborne. And yet the problem with the Chief Medical Officer agreeing with that is it means that the hotel quarantine system can't function properly. And it then puts the pressure back on the government to build some purpose-built quarantine centres. And that's what Scott Morrison is afraid of, because he's then in charge of them. This is a Prime Minister who has demonstrated utter incompetence and wanting to avoid responsibility over his core constitutional responsibility. He is in charge of quarantine. He doesn't ask the states when he flies refugees across from Manus Island or off into Christmas Island. He doesn't ask the states their permission. He just does it. He doesn't care what they think on these issues when it suits him. And what he has done is abandoned 9,000 Australians who put him in harm's way. And I say to the Chief Medical Officer, I tell you what's more dangerous to Australian citizens than those statistics he's quoted in quarantine, leaving them to get COVID in India. That is deadly.
Get them home. The pause on flights, though, isn't that something that a pandemic requires?
If you've done the hard work beforehand, and that's the problem. Scott Morrison has refused to take up his constitutional obligation, never mind his moral obligation. You know, I think Andrew Bolt last night read out what's written in every Australian's passport about the right to return home.
Yeah.
I mean, this is an extraordinary circumstance where the Prime Minister is locking out Australian citizens who are in harm's way. And that's the difference. The Chief Medical Officer has ignored the health risk to the Australians in India in that advice. That is a disgrace.
Just one more on the PM this morning. He talked about that Biosecurity Act, and looking for his quote here, he says, the chances of any Australian being fined or jailed during suspension is pretty much zero. That was his quote this morning, talking about that Biosecurity Act. What do you make of that? Does that change anything? I mean, Jeffrey Robertson said this morning that it's either one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you don't put a law in place and say we won't use it, okay? But what he's terrified of is that the IPL cricketers were going to organise for a charter flight to go and pick them all up and bring them home, while the rest of the 9,000 Australians were sitting there not able to get into the country. He panicked. A complete overreaction. He knew the political optics of the Australian cricketers being brought home on a charter flight by the Australian Cricket Board would look shocking.
He says the Prime Minister's got blood on his hands. Do you agree with Michael Slater?
If one Australian who is locked in India because they can't get on a plane in a crisis situation catches COVID and ends up dying, it is on the Prime Minister's head. No question. It's on the Prime Minister's head. It's his decisions, his lack of leadership. If one of those 9,000 Australians in the queue catches COVID and dies, it is on the Prime Minister.
All right. Stephen Conroy, always good to chat. No time to talk China today, but good to have you as always.
No worries.
Talk to you soon.